They say that cities remember. Their stones, their seas, their silence, all whisper the names of those who refuse to kneel. And in the port city of Alexandria, where the blue of the Mediterranean meets the dust of empire, one name still lingers in the wind: Muhammad Karim. He was not a king. He was not born into legend. He was rather an ordinary man who, when tested by the fire of history, chose to stand when others bent. And in his stand he became something greater, the conscience of a conquered city. The year was 1798. Europe was aflame with ambition. Revolutions had unseated monarchs, and a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 29, looked east, toward the cradle of civilization, Egypt. To him, Egypt was not just a prize of conquest, it was a gateway, a bridge between Europe and Asia, between the past and the empire he dreamed to build. Napoleon's army of 35,000 men crossed the Mediterranean under the burning summer sun. Their ships, dark and immense, appeared on the Alexandrian horizon like a swarm of steel locusts. For the people of Egypt, the sea had always been a giver, of trade, of stories, of life. Now it carried death. In the heart of the city stood Muhammad Karim, the Ottoman-appointed governor of Alexandria. He was a man of discipline and pride, neither rich nor born to privilege. But he was deeply rooted, a son of Alexandria in every breath. His loyalty was to his land and his people, not to the distant palaces of Istanbul, nor to the ambitious generals of Europe. When word reached him that the French fleet had been sighted off the coast, he summoned his guards and the city's merchants. He knew their numbers were small, their weapons few, and their allies uncertain. But he also knew that surrender was not a word Alexandria would speak easily. The morning the French landed, the air trembled with cannon fire. Napoleon's forces moved swiftly, disciplined, unstoppable, their banners casting long shadows across the sand. The defenders of Alexandria, soldiers, craftsmen, fishermen, and students, fought with desperate courage. The sound of muskets echoed through the narrow alleys. Women cried from rooftops, calling upon God and the prophet to save their sons. For 2 days the city resisted. Karim moved among the fighters, his robes torn, his face smeared with dust and gunpowder. He was not a general commanding from afar. He was a man among men, urging them to hold the line even as hope began to fade. But resistance alone could not stop the storm. The French artillery breached the walls and the city's gates fell. Napoleon entered Alexandria, victorious, calculating, his gaze already fixed on Cairo and beyond. He saw in the ruins not just conquest but destiny. Yet among those ruins stood a man he could not easily subdue, Muhammad Karim. Karim was captured, his hands bound, his people silenced. The conqueror demanded obedience, but Karim offered only defiance. Even in chains, he held himself with dignity, refusing to bow. To the French officers who urged him to accept Napoleon's rule, he replied simply, "I was entrusted with this city. I will not betray it even in defeat." That defiance unnerved Napoleon. He admired courage, even in his enemies, but he could not tolerate rebellion. Still, something about Karim's unwavering pride intrigued him. He ordered that the governor be brought before him. The encounter between the Corsican conqueror and the Egyptian patriot has been retold in many tongues, in French letters, in Arabic chronicles, and in whispers passed through generations. Napoleon looked at the prisoner and saw not a barbarian, not a coward, but a man of principle. And perhaps for a moment he saw himself, the young officer who had once defied kings. "Why did you resist?" Napoleon asked. "You could have surrendered and kept your post. The city would have been spared." Karim's voice was steady. "I was appointed to protect this city. If I open its gates to an invader, what am I then? A traitor? A servant of your empire? My people would curse my name and I would deserve it." The French general smiled faintly, not with joy but with recognition. He had met many who lied to save themselves. Karim, he realized, was not one of them. But admiration was not mercy. Napoleon left the room and told his officers to confine Karim under guard. The city was pacified but not tamed. Whispers of resistance still moved through its streets, carried by the same wind that once filled the sails of ancient fleets. As weeks passed, Napoleon issued decrees in the name of liberty and reason, claiming to bring enlightenment to the East. But in the bazaars and mosques, Egyptians spoke of occupation, not enlightenment. They saw their governor imprisoned, their traditions mocked, their autonomy stripped. To them, the invaders were not philosophers. They were colonizers in the language of cannon and greed. Napoleon's advisors warned him that Karim's presence, even in captivity, was dangerous. His silence inspired more than 100 proclamations. He was a symbol now, and symbols are the hardest enemies to kill. So, Napoleon made his choice. He would make an example of the governor of Alexandria. The order was written: Muhammad Karim was to be tried for rebellion. The court was a formality, the verdict already known. He was to be executed by firing squad. Yet even now Napoleon hesitated. He was no stranger to blood, but this man's courage demanded respect. So he sent word to the city's merchants, the same men who once stood beside Karim in the council hall. He told them, "Bring me 10,000 gold coins. By your governor's life, and I will let him go." It was not a ransom of greed, it was a test of loyalty. Would they value one man's courage enough to pay its price? Days passed. The merchants gathered, whispered, calculated. 10,000 gold coins was no small sum. But the truth was cruel: they feared French power more than they loved Karim. And so they refused. When the messenger returned to Napoleon, his face was grave. "The merchants will not pay." Napoleon nodded. "So be it." And so, on a quiet morning in September 1798, in the courtyard of his own city, Muhammad Karim was led to the place of execution. He wore no chains. He refused the blindfold. He looked upon the rising sun over Alexandria's walls, the same sun that had witnessed his city's fall, and he smiled faintly. He said nothing of revenge, nothing of fear. Only one sentence has survived the centuries, spoken in a calm, steady voice. "Tell my people that I died loyal to them, and that loyalty is the only freedom a man truly owns." The rifles were raised. A volley echoed across the courtyard. And just like that, silence returned to Alexandria. But silence can carry memory. And from that moment on, the name Muhammad Karim ceased to belong to one man. It became the pulse of a city. His death was not an end, but a beginning. A seed buried in the sands of oppression, waiting for generations to uncover it again. Years later, when Egyptians rose again to demand their freedom from foreign rule, they would speak his name with reverence. Writers like Abdul Rahman al-Rafi'i and thinkers like Rashid Rida retold his story not as tragedy, but as prophecy. They said he burned so that others might see the light. That he was the first spark of a national awakening, the martyr whose blood marked Egypt's path to independence. And even now, if you walk through the streets of old Alexandria, past the crumbling fortresses and weathered mosques, past the fishermen who cast their nets into the same waters Napoleon once crossed, you can almost hear him. A voice in the wind, quiet but unyielding, saying, "Freedom is not given. It is remembered." Empires rise not only on the strength of armies but on the silence of those they conquer. Napoleon believed he had silenced Alexandria when Muhammad Karim fell. But silence, like the sea, has tides, and the tide of resistance was already turning beneath the surface. The city mourned in secret. They buried their governor not in marble but in memory. Mothers whispered his name to their sons as a prayer. Fathers told his story to their daughters as a warning. And in that way Muhammad Karim did not die, he multiplied. The French occupation of Egypt was unlike any conquest before it. Napoleon had come not only with soldiers but with scholars, engineers, astronomers, artists, linguists, an entire corps of savants determined to study, catalogue and reshape Egypt in the image of Europe. They called it the civilizing mission. But to the Egyptians it was something else, a foreign hand rewriting their identity. Cairo fell soon after Alexandria. Napoleon entered the city with proclamations written in Arabic, declaring friendship for Islam, admiration for the Prophet and respect for the Quran. He told the people that he had come to free them from the tyranny of the Mamluks, the ruling class of mercenary soldiers who had long dominated Egypt. But behind the words of liberation were cannons and muskets. In the mosques, scholars debated his intentions. Could an infidel general truly claim friendship with the faith of Muhammad? Could a man who destroyed cities claim to bring enlightenment? The truth became clear in time. Napoleon's proclamations were masks, elegant lies meant to pacify a proud people. Taxes rose, soldiers marched through sacred streets, and the French tricolor replaced the Ottoman crescent over the citadel. Egypt, for the first time in centuries, had been occupied not by a neighboring empire but by the far west, a world that neither spoke its tongue nor shared its soul. And yet, amid this humiliation, Muhammad Karim's memory began to gather power. In coffee houses and courtyards, people spoke of him as the one who refused. His name became a symbol, not of defeat but of dignity. He had faced the greatest general of Europe and chosen death over submission. For the Egyptian people, who had been taught obedience by centuries of rulers, this defiance was revolutionary. Napoleon, from his palace in Cairo, sensed the change. He had intended Karim's execution as a warning. Instead, it became a spark. He began to fear not armies but ideas. In his journals he wrote of Egypt with fascination and frustration. He admired the land's ancient grandeur but despised its resistance to transformation. He wanted Egypt to be a mirror of France, modern, rational, submissive to his vision. But Egypt refused to be remade. The same spirit that had animated Karim now haunted every corner of the land. In October, only weeks after Karim's death, a revolt erupted in Cairo. The people took up arms, shouting for freedom, for faith, for vengeance. French troops stormed the city, their discipline clashing with fury that could not be contained. The revolt was crushed, but it left an indelible mark, proof that the Egyptian heart was not conquered. Napoleon left Egypt soon after, departing secretly in 1799, leaving his army behind. His ambitions turned once again to Europe, where greater thrones awaited. But he carried Egypt within him, the taste of its dust, the echo of its defiance, and perhaps the memory of a single man who would not bend. Years passed. The French occupation ended. Other rulers came. The Ottomans returned, the British arrived, and the world continued its relentless march. But in Alexandria, Muhammad Karim's name endured. It passed from one generation to the next, a legend half remembered, half believed but always honored. When the Egyptian national awakening began in the late 19th century, historians searched their past for symbols. They found many, warriors, scholars, reformers, but none so pure, so uncompromised as Muhammad Karim. He was the perfect martyr for a nation still learning to define itself. A man who had stood alone against empire, whose betrayal by his own city reflected Egypt's long struggle between fear and pride. The nationalist writer Abdul Rahman al-Rafi'i retold the story with moral clarity. He wrote that Napoleon had offered Karim his life in exchange for 10,000 gold coins, but the merchants refused to pay. The image was powerful, a city that would not save its own guardian. Some historians doubted the story's literal truth, but few doubted its meaning. It spoke to something deeper than fact, the moral cost of cowardice, the loneliness of heroes. In the 20th century, Egypt's struggle for independence reignited the legend. Newspapers invoked Karim's name as a symbol of patriotic sacrifice. When British forces occupied Egypt in 1882, nationalists drew direct parallels. France had brought muskets and promises of enlightenment. Britain brought railways and the rhetoric of progress. But both had come for the same reason: control. And in every debate about resistance, one name returned like a ghost: Muhammad Karim. He became, in time, more than a man. He was a story, a moral compass. Teachers told his tale in classrooms. Poets wove it into verse. He became Egypt's first modern martyr, a bridge between the warriors of the past and the patriots of the future. The philosopher Muhammad Rashid Rida wrote decades later, "Karim was a man who burned himself so that his ignorant nation might see the light." It was not an insult but a lament, that such sacrifice had been necessary to awaken a sleeping people. Karim's death, in that sense, was both tragedy and prophecy. He showed Egypt the cost of freedom long before it was ready to pay it. In the 1920s and 1930s, as Egyptian nationalism blossomed into a mass movement, Karim's image adorned pamphlets and speeches. His story was retold in theaters and newspapers as a lesson in courage and betrayal. Some writers imagined him on the morning of his execution, looking not at his captors but at the horizon, dreaming of a future Egypt free of foreign chains. Others portrayed him as a prophet of modern independence, a voice echoing across time to remind Egyptians that dignity is never given, it must be reclaimed. And yet, even as his legend grew, the historical man remained elusive. Few documents survived: a handful of French records, a few Arabic accounts, fragments of testimony. The rest was memory, myth, and meaning. But perhaps that is how all heroes survive, not through documents but through the stories that refuse to die. In the ruins of the old Alexandrian fortress, the same stones that once echoed with cannon fire now sit in silence. Tourists pass by, unaware that beneath their feet lies the memory of a man who faced an empire with nothing but his conviction. The waves crash against the shore, the gulls cry above the port, and the city carries on, alive, chaotic, eternal. But if you listen closely, you can still feel it, a heartbeat beneath the noise. The heartbeat of a city that once said no. Muhammad Karim's legacy is not carved in statues or inscribed in palaces. It lives in the spirit of defiance that Egypt still carries. Every time a generation stands against oppression, his voice whispers through time. Every protest, every poem, every cry for dignity carries the echo of that morning in 1798, when one man stood before the rifles and chose loyalty over life. History rarely remembers such moments as they truly were. It polishes them, bends them, reshapes them to fit the needs of the present. But beneath the legend there remains a truth no empire can erase. That courage, when born of love for one's people, outlives every conqueror. Napoleon's empire is gone. Its victories, its monuments, its illusions of eternity, all turned to dust. But Muhammad Karim endures. Not in marble or gold but in memory, unbroken, undefeated. He is the ghost of Alexandria, the watchman of Egypt's conscience, the martyr who still guards the gates of freedom. And so, when the waves of empire rise again, as they always do, and when nations once more stand at the edge of surrender, remember him. Remember the man who faced the storm and said, "No further." Remember Muhammad Karim, governor of a fallen city, guardian of an unbroken soul. Because history, like the sea, never forgets the names of those who refuse to drown. Time, they say, buries the dead and forgets their names. But every now and then, a story defies that law. It refuses to fade, refuses to rest, and keeps walking through centuries, whispering its truth into new ears. Such is the story of Muhammad Karim. After his execution in 1798, Egypt would endure decades of foreign control. The Ottomans returned in name, but in reality their grip was weak. The Mamluks were broken, their once feared cavalry scattered. Into this vacuum stepped a new figure, Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian officer who would rebuild Egypt from the ruins of conquest. He modernized the army, drained the swamps, built schools and factories. But even as the new order rose, the question remained, who truly ruled Egypt, and for whom? The people remembered. They remembered the French who had promised progress and delivered occupation. They remembered the merchants who had chosen gold over honor. And they remembered their governor, the man who stood alone, loyal only to his people. In their memory, Muhammad Karim became the moral measure of every ruler who came after him. When Muhammad Ali executed his rivals and consolidated power, many Egyptians compared his ruthlessness to that of Napoleon. But some also saw in him the same fierce determination, the same belief that Egypt's destiny should belong to Egyptians, not to distant thrones or foreign generals. In this strange way, Karim's spirit lived on even in those who never spoke his name. As the 19th century progressed, the world changed again. Steamships replaced sails, telegraphs replaced messengers, and the empires of Europe grew hungrier. Egypt became the jewel everyone wanted, the crossroad of trade, the heart of the East. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, Egypt's importance multiplied 100-fold. And with importance came danger. Britain and France, pretending to protect their interests, began to weave their influence into every corner of Egyptian life. Its banks, its railways, its government. By 1882, British troops landed on Egyptian soil, and the country found itself once more under foreign rule. History had turned a cruel circle. Yet this time something was different. Egypt had learned from its past. It had seen Muhammad Karim die for honor, and it had seen what came from silence. So when the British took control, a new generation began to rise. Journalists, poets, teachers, lawyers, men and women who believed that words could be weapons and that history itself could be a battlefield. They turned to the stories of their forefathers to find strength, and there they found Karim waiting. His defiance became a rallying cry, his loyalty a mirror for their own struggle. In speeches and writings, nationalists invoked him as the first to die for Egypt's freedom. They called him Shahid al-Iskandariya, the Martyr of Alexandria. Abdul Rahman al-Rafi'i, one of the early chroniclers of modern Egypt, wrote passionately about him. He portrayed Karim as a man of faith and principle who stood against tyranny not out of politics, but out of conscience. In Rafi'i's words, Karim became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol of the eternal conflict between courage and corruption. And perhaps that is why his story resonated so deeply. Because Egypt, in every era, faced the same question he once faced: to resist or to submit, to speak or to stay silent, to pay the price of freedom or to live in comfort under chains. Writers and intellectuals in the early 20th century built upon this moral foundation. In the newspapers of Cairo, editorials would draw parallels between Karim's sacrifice and the new martyrs of the age: students killed in protests, farmers shot during uprisings, and thinkers imprisoned for their words. Each was said to carry the soul of Muhammad Karim. The philosopher and reformer Rashid Rida, a man deeply troubled by the weakness of the Muslim world before Western imperialism, found in Karim's story a perfect metaphor. He wrote that Karim was a man who burned himself for his people so that they might see light. It was both admiration and accusation. Admiration for the hero, accusation for the nation that had abandoned him. In Rida's mind, Karim's tragedy was not just that he died, but that he had to die alone. That his people had not yet learned to stand together. This idea, that nations must awaken through sacrifice, became the heartbeat of modern Egyptian nationalism. In the cafes of Cairo, students debated the meaning of freedom. In the schools, teachers told stories of heroes, and in the hearts of the poor, the dream of dignity began to take root. Everywhere, the legend of Muhammad Karim was reborn, not as an echo of the past but as a warning to the present. Poets joined the chorus. Some imagined the moment before his execution, his eyes fixed on the sea, whispering to the waves that carried the invaders, "You may rule the land but not its soul." Others turned his silence into song, describing him as a man who spoke only once, with his death, and that was enough to shake the conscience of the world. Even in the early days of Egyptian cinema, Karim's story found new life. In black and white frames, actors portrayed him as the noble governor betrayed by greed, standing tall before the might of France. Audiences wept in dark theaters as the shots rang out, not for a man long dead, but for every Egyptian who had ever been silenced by power. But beyond the art and politics there was something deeper. Karim's story had become a mirror through which Egypt saw itself, proud, wounded, and searching for redemption. He was the embodiment of an idea that outlived empires, that true strength is moral, not material. By the mid-20th century, when the struggle against British rule reached its height, his name once again surfaced in speeches and slogans. In 1952, when young officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the monarchy, the revolutionaries invoked Egypt's martyrs, from Karim to Arabi to the fallen of the modern age. They saw themselves as heirs to that same legacy of defiance. The cycle had come full circle. A new Alexandria was rising, built not on surrender but on sacrifice. Yet as decades passed, Egypt's story grew more complex. Empires fell but power remained seductive. Governments changed, rulers came and went, but the people still searched for the pure courage Muhammad Karim had shown. He became, once again, both inspiration and challenge, a reminder of what leadership should mean. In the modern age, with its noise and speed, many have forgotten the details of his life. Few remember the exact date of his execution, or the streets where he walked. But his spirit lingers quietly in the Egyptian imagination, a symbol of incorruptible loyalty. Teachers still mention his name when they speak of patriotism. Writers still invoke him when they describe the price of honor. And if one listens closely, the message remains the same as it was in 1798. That freedom is not a gift from conquerors or kings. That loyalty to one's people outweighs every order. And that dignity is the only inheritance worth dying for. The sea still kisses the stones of Alexandria, the same sea that once brought Napoleon's ships to its shore. But now the city stands on its own, proud and unyielding, its people bound by centuries of struggle. They walk beneath the same sky that watched Muhammad Karim take his last breath, and though they may not always speak his name, they live in the world he helped shape. Because in the end, martyrdom is not about death. It is about continuity. A martyr is a bridge between what was and what must be. Muhammad Karim built that bridge with his courage. And across it, generations have marched toward freedom. Empires may return, flags may change, and rulers may rise and fall. But as long as Egypt remembers, as long as Alexandria's wind carries his name, the martyr of Alexandria will never truly die. History often hides its deepest truths in the smallest moments. A signature on a page. A breath before the trigger is pulled. A man standing alone in the courtyard of his conquered city. In that instant, between life and death, obedience and defiance, history finds its soul. Muhammad Karim's final act was not only political, it was philosophical. He forced the world to confront a question that has echoed through centuries. What is loyalty and what is freedom? To the French, loyalty meant submission to the vision of civilization. To the Ottomans, it meant obedience to empire. But to Karim, loyalty was something older, something sacred. It was the invisible thread that bound him to his city, to its people, its faith, its future. He believed that if a man surrendered, that he surrendered everything that made him human. When Napoleon's soldiers raised their rifles, they thought they were executing rebellion. But what they killed that day was not defiance, it was proof of conscience. And conscience, unlike flesh, cannot be buried. In the centuries that followed, philosophers and revolutionaries across the world would face the same dilemma. In India, Latin America, Africa, the colonized would ask themselves, what is the worth of peace if it costs our dignity? And across those distant lands, the story of men like Muhammad Karim would resurface, not as history but as guidance. Empires speak the language of permanence. They build monuments, write laws, and map the world as though their rule will last forever. But men like Karim remind us that no empire can last on borrowed obedience. They can conquer bodies but not beliefs. They can silence voices but not memory. In his refusal to bow, Karim joined a brotherhood of timeless spirits. From the Spartans who held the line at Thermopylae, to the scholars of Baghdad who refused to abandon their books to fire, to the rebels who rose against colonial rule in every corner of the earth. Each one in their own time looked into the eyes of power and said no. There is a kind of immortality in that word. It is the simplest act of rebellion and yet the most dangerous. Because when one man refuses to submit, he gives others permission to dream of freedom. And dreams are contagious. In the quiet after his execution, the French officers thought the matter closed. They had dealt with the rebel, secured the city, restored order. But they did not understand the soil they stood on. Egypt's ground has absorbed the blood of pharaohs and prophets, conquerors and martyrs, and it remembers. It carries memory the way the Nile carries life. Endlessly, silently, inevitably. Years later, when Egypt's streets would again fill with protesters demanding independence, it was said that in Alexandria, the wind blew stronger on certain days. As if the sea itself recalled the governor who would not yield. The people could not see him but they felt him. In the courage that made them march. In the pride that made them speak. In the hope that made them endure. That is how martyrdom truly works. It does not glorify death, it sanctifies resistance. It turns defeat into foundation. It transforms pain into inheritance. Muhammad Karim never wrote a manifesto, never led an army across deserts, never claimed divine right. And yet, his single act of moral defiance achieved what no army could. He gave his people a compass. A direction to face when the world demanded submission. Even Napoleon in his later years is said to have reflected on Egypt with fascination. In exile on St. Helena, the former emperor reportedly mused that Egypt had been the turning point of his destiny. A campaign that revealed not his power but his limits. He could conquer cities but not souls. He could bend nations but not men like Karim. There is something profoundly human in that irony. The conqueror and the conquered, bound forever by a single moment of defiance. Napoleon became a legend of empire, Karim became a legend of conscience. And though one ruled empires and the other ruled only his own heart, it is Karim's victory that endures, because moral courage outlives conquest. Centuries later the world would see new Napoleons, men who marched under banners of progress, who spoke of order, civilization, reform, and yet brought with them the same shadow of domination. But wherever they went they found new Muhammads, new Karims, new voices rising from forgotten corners of the world to say, "We are not yours to rule." In this way Muhammad Karim belongs not only to Egypt, but to humanity. He is the quiet ancestor of every person who has ever stood before authority and said, "I will not betray what I believe." And if one listens closely, there is a rhythm to these acts of resistance. From Alexandria to Delhi, from Algiers to Havana. A heartbeat that transcends language, creed, or nation. It is the sound of the human spirit insisting on dignity. Let us, then, imagine the moment again. The courtyard, the dawn, the rifles. The wind carries the scent of the sea, seagulls cry overhead. Muhammad Karim stands unflinching. The officer offers him a blindfold, he refuses. There is silence, a deep, terrible silence that swallows the world. And in that silence, a truth is born. He does not die screaming. He does not beg. He simply breathes one last time. And in that breath carries the entire weight of his people's hope. The shots ring out. And for a heartbeat even the sea stops moving. When the smoke clears his body falls, but his idea does not. It rises, invisible, indestructible, and begins its long journey through time. To Cairo, where poets would write his name in secret. To classrooms, where teachers would whisper his story to students under colonial rule. To printing presses, where journalists would print his defiance between the lines of censored news. To freedom movements across the world, where nameless men and women would draw courage from his silence. That is immortality, not statues or ceremonies, but the echo of courage that teaches others how to live. Even today when we speak of patriotism, of sacrifice, of freedom, we are speaking the language men like Muhammad Karim taught us. The language of dignity without compromise. And perhaps that is the truest throne of all. Not the marble seat of emperors, but the throne of conscience that no empire can conquer. The throne that belongs to the unknown. To those whose names are carried not in history books, but in the beating hearts of free people. So when we look back at 1798, let us not see only a fallen city or a lost governor, Let us see a man who became eternal because he refused to betray himself. The world remembers kings, but it reveres martyrs. Kings rule by fear. Martyrs rule by example. And Muhammad Karim, governor, patriot, martyr, rules still, quietly from the throne unknown. The sea has no memory, they say, and yet it never forgets. It returns every wave to the shore again and again, as if repeating a lesson mankind refuses to learn. Empires rise. Empires fall. But the courage of a single soul can outlast them all. 2 centuries have passed since that morning in Alexandria. The cannons have fallen silent. The soldiers have turned to dust. Napoleon's empire, once stretching across continents, exists now only in museums and history books. But Muhammad Karim's story, the story of a man who chose honor over survival, continues to ripple across time. In modern Egypt, his name appears in schoolbooks, his tale told briefly to students who may never know the full depth of his sacrifice. They read that he resisted Napoleon, that he was executed, that he became a martyr. But behind those few lines lies the entire anatomy of human courage, the eternal struggle between conscience and fear. Each generation that hears his name hears it differently. To some, he is a patriot. To others, a symbol of moral purity. But to all, he remains a reminder that freedom is never cheap, and that silence before tyranny is a slow kind of death. In the bustling streets of modern Alexandria, his story is not told in speeches but in spirit. When a fisherman returns from the sea and refuses to cheat his neighbor, when a teacher speaks truth even when it is dangerous, when a young activist stands against corruption knowing the price, that is Muhammad Karim living quietly in them all. Because his story was never about a war between nations. It was about the war within the human heart. Between fear and conviction. Between convenience and conscience. Between surviving and truly living. Every age faces its own empires. Some wear uniforms, others wear suits. Some invade with cannons, others with contracts, algorithms, and lies. But the essence of oppression never changes. It demands your obedience, your silence, your surrender. And the essence of resistance never changes either. It begins with one person who says, no. Muhammad Karim's defiance was not an act of rage but of clarity. He saw the truth of his moment, that peace without dignity is just another form of slavery. He understood that a nation that trades its pride for comfort will one day find itself with neither. And so he stood, knowing full well that his stand would cost him everything. The French called him a rebel. The Ottomans a fool. But history called him what he truly was, a man awake in a world half asleep. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because every era needs its awakeners, those who remind the comfortable of their duties, the fearful of their strength, and the hopeless that some values are worth dying for. In 2011, when the squares of Cairo and Alexandria filled once again with the voices of ordinary people demanding freedom, the air felt charged with old ghosts. No one spoke his name aloud, but his spirit was there. In every chant that rose into the night sky, in every tear gas cloud that failed to silence conviction, in every flag raised by hands that refused to bow, it was as if the Martyr of Alexandria had returned, not in flesh but in flame. History is circular that way. The same questions return wearing new masks. Who are we? What do we owe to truth? How much are we willing to lose for what we love? For Muhammad Karim the answer was simple: everything. He had no illusions of victory, no promises of immortality. But he understood that to live honorably even for a day was better than to live a lifetime on one's knees. And that is the essence of heroism. Not grand gestures but quiet certainty. The courage to stand when standing seems impossible. The wisdom to die without bitterness. The faith that even if no one remembers your name, the meaning of your act will endure. That is why we call him the Martyr of Alexandria. Not because he died but because his death gave life to something larger than himself. He proved that moral power can stand taller than any empire, that integrity can outshine the wealth of nations, and that one man's truth can shake the foundations of history. Somewhere in the heart of the modern city, near the sea, there stands a modest plaque bearing his name. Tourists pass by, snapping photos of the harbor, unaware that they stand where a man once gave his life for a principle. The gulls wheel overhead. The scent of salt fills the air. And if you close your eyes you might hear it. A faint echo, a whisper carried by the wind. Tell my people that I died loyal to them. And that loyalty is the only freedom a man truly owns. That line, whether spoken in history or born from legend, is more than farewell, it is instruction. It is a message to every generation that follows. Be loyal, not to rulers, not to riches, not to fear, but to truth, to dignity, to the better angels of your nation's soul. And so, from the silence of that courtyard, a philosophy was born. One that still stands unshaken. As long as there are men and women who choose conscience over comfort. In the end, every empire faces its test. Not on the battlefield but in the mirror of time. France once thought itself eternal. And yet the world remembers Napoleon's ambition as much as it remembers his downfall. But Egypt, ancient, wounded, reborn 1,000 times, remembers something different. It remembers a governor who could have chosen safety and chose sacrifice instead. He was not a prophet. He was not a warrior. He was simply human. And that, perhaps, is what makes him divine in memory. A reminder that greatness lies not in power but in principle. The story of Muhammad Karim ends not with his death, but with every act of courage that follows it. Every time a person stands against injustice, every time a people rise to reclaim their dignity, the Martyr of Alexandria breathes again. For history is not a graveyard of heroes, it is a garden of their seeds. And as long as one of those seeds takes root in the heart of the living, freedom will never be lost. So remember him, not as a relic of the past, but as a companion in your own age of uncertainty. When you face the moment that demands courage, when the world tells you to yield, think of that man standing in the dawn light of a conquered city, his back straight, his voice calm, refusing the blindfold, refusing the lie, and choosing to meet death with open eyes. That is the legacy of Muhammad Karim, the governor who became a martyr, the rebel who became a teacher, the forgotten who became immortal. And as the waves of Alexandria crash against the shore, they still seem to speak his name. Not loudly, not with grandeur, but softly, endlessly, like a prayer whispered through time. Freedom is not given. It is remembered,